Welcome to the Deal by Me podcast, where we ask guests to tell us your story. Hello there, this is Dr. James W. Smith, your host. We seek to transform lives by encouraging and inspiring. Someone encouraged and inspired this host, a former lawyer, gambler, inmate, and his life was transformed. The same can happen to you. So when you listen to any of the Deal by Me podcasts, please support this podcast with a donation or a monthly recurring amount for as little as $3. If you're viewing any of the podcasts on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To supporters of this podcast, we say thank you. Check out my encouraging, inspiring, and transforming books. I'm available for speaking engagements, in-person and virtual seminars, so please contact me through my website, www.dealbyme.com. I have with me Janet Sherlund, who is the author of Abandoned at Birth. She says that her single most significant life event was being given up for adoption at birth. It led her to a lifelong quest to find her biological mother. This is a very interesting and compelling story, and I'm sure you will enjoy this interview. So, Janet, uh, would you share a little bit about yourself to listeners of this podcast and let us know where you've been interviewed from?
Sure. Good morning, James, and thank you for having me have this conversation with you. I'm speaking to you this morning from our home on the island of Nantucket, which is 30 miles out at sea off the coast of Massachusetts, and very special to me, very special place, the home of my heart, a place that's surrounded by light that's most amazing, and the wind is always blowing and the air is always fresh, and I fall asleep to the sound of the waves breaking at night. So that's pretty much heaven on earth.
Well, I love that. I love that. It sounds so soothing.
It is. It
Yeah.
is, and I think it's been a big part of helping me heal over the years here. I think the sound of the sea and just looking out at the horizon, where the sea and the sky meet, and it's kind of, as Melville said, I think the closest we get to eternity on Earth. And
Mhm.
I think that sort of meditation has
Okay.
really helped me.
All right. Well, I have had the opportunity to uh, look at your profile, to read it. It's very compelling, very interesting and intriguing. One that I'm certain that listeners of this podcast will enjoy as they listen to the podcast. And I want to ask you a couple of questions because you your profile is one that really is right in line with what I do. As someone who's about encouraging, inspiring, and transforming, and what you've done is just amazing. So I know you've written a book that's entitled "Abandoned at Birth." I, I know listeners of this podcast would like to just know a little bit more about your personal journey that inspired you to write this book. What motivated you uh, to write this memoir? It had to be something, you know.
Yeah.
So what
It
was it?
was. And so I was abandoned at birth. My birth mother was a teenage mother back in the 50s, and had me and gave me up without looking at me or holding me or helping care for me, which was the normal practice of the agency that I was adopted through, and other agencies at the time. So they noted that as very unusual. Um, and I was then in foster care for about 5 weeks before the agency assigned me to the next family on the list, basically. And I went to the home that I was raised in, and given an identity, given a borrowed name and a borrowed ethnic identity. I was adopted in they call it the baby snatch era, or the era of closed adoptions and sealed records. So I had my true heritage and my true ethnicity and true identity were hidden from me, still are legally. My birth records are still sealed in the state of New Jersey, where I was adopted, even at my age. And so there was no, so the woman, the individual I was born to be was completely erased, and I was handed to a borrowed family, as I call them, and they raised me. And one of the things that I think is difficult to understand haven't, if you have a family and you have a blood connection to this world, is what it's like to not have that. And I know as I was growing up, and I'd say to friends, oh, I wish I could see someone who looked like me, or I wish I shared interests with my family. They'd say, oh, that's not important. I don't look like my parents, or I don't like my parents, or I am the only one in my family that likes this or that. But they had that attachment. They had, if they felt different in their family, they knew what they were pushing against. They had a wall to push against. There wasn't just nothing there. And if they were similar to their family, they saw themselves mirrored and reflected and were affirmed in their behaviors and their choices. And when everything that you are connected to, similar to the lineage you've come from, the family you've descended through, disappears, is taken from you through
Mhm.
no choice of your own, you have nothing. And many of us as adoptees talk about this big black hole in our center.
Mm,
And
mm,
we really struggle to form a self.
mhm,
There's like nothing there. It's like, who do we look like? Where do we come from? Why were we given away? What's so awful about us that no one in our family wanted to keep us?
mm,
And you can go through life with a perfectly fine adoptive experience and a perfectly normal and acceptable family life. But one of the hard truths about adoption is that love is not enough to erase the trauma and the pain of being given away and not knowing who you are. And it
mm,
helps. I mean, it's wonderful to have. I don't want to lose that truth.
mhm,
But even the most loving adoptive parents can't give an adoptee that knowledge of who they truly are. And you feel it. You feel it's like almost an animalistic thing, like
mhm,
animals can recognize their offspring in a crowd of
mhm,
similar offspring.
mm,
I think we as humans are more chemical than we like to think, and you can feel it in your bones and your DNA, and in just some part of you, that you are not like the other people around you, and you don't know who you are from and where you do come from. And it's a great sense of, there's grief and there's loss
mm.
and there's a struggle to figure out who you are.
I sense you very well, and the reason I do, not necessarily from your viewpoint, but from the fact of not knowing who, in my case, my father was.
Mm,
Never knew him, never knew him.
yeah.
And I grew up in an environment where I had lots of male figures. I had all of everything else. But as you get later on in life, you always wonder, mm, what was he like? Do I have any of his traits? Is there
Yeah.
anything that I would have done different had he been in my life? So these kinds of things. So I feel you.
Yeah.
I really
And today,
do.
even today, of course, adoption is more open today in
Hmm.
many cases, but we have new issues coming up. Donor
Hmm.
conceived individuals. And
Hmm.
these young adults have been conceived through sperm donation are saying, wait a minute, we need to know more about our father than he was specimen 1, 2, 3, or
Hmm.
no cancer in his family. I mean, the it's fascinating to really look at how we form our sense of self, how lost we feel without that biological connection,
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
much the DNA. I mean, my mind was blown when I ultimately did meet biological family, and not only in myself but in my children, saw the choices DNA had made for me. When
Hmm.
I was growing up, there was a lot of talk that it was nurture, not nature. But I'm here to tell you it's nature. I mean,
Okay.
Nurture's
Okay.
good. Nurture's nice.
Yeah,
It's good
yeah.
to have good, but and it's you're blessed to have, love and a good home. But through no anyone involved in adoption, adoptive
Yeah.
parent, for them, I think to be able to understand that your child can love you and you can love them and help them and they can be grateful for the home they're in, but you can't take away that pain and loss. So let's
Mhm.
talk about it. Let's say to them, I know you have a different mother and father. I know let's
S-
name that disconnect.
So are you suggesting that it's wise for the adopted parents to share that information with the adoptee?
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
okay,
And I think
all right,
they're
makes
doing
sense.
that now. They're doing that
Okay,
more now.
okay,
And
okay.
because I think it recognizes who you are and you
Mm-hmm.
are an individual. And this is not on my, but the other night I was watching American Idol. I rarely watch American Idol, but there was this beautiful young woman who had been adopted from Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
And she was adopted to a family in Maine. And at her audition, she had when she was 18, she said to them, look, I'm grateful for you and I love you, but I need to know where I came from and who my birth mother was. And they helped her find her and
Okay,
make a decision.
okay,
And she was singing she did her song for her birth mother. And it was just an amazingly shattering rendition of an Aretha Franklin song, I Can't Make You Love Me. And that's probably not the right title. But
wow, wow.
anyway, and she slayed it. But the I know that there was a sort of a discomfort on part of maybe some people watching and some of the judges that, oh, well, you're singing for your birth mother. What about the mother who raised you?
Mm-hmm.
And what I wanted to say to the TV is, I'm sure she loves and she had spoken so
Mm-hmm.
fondly about her adoptive family, but when you don't know, when you grow up not knowing who you are and not knowing where you came from and not feeling that bonding, that connection, and then you find it,
Mm-hmm.
it is so
Okay,
transformative. It is the first time in your life you're you're saying, I'm real and I'm true and I
okay.
exist and I am the way I am for a reason. And it gives you such a sense of completion and wholeness that it is so much deeper and more transformative than the storyline of were you given up or were you raised. It's a profound primal
Yeah.
experience.
Jenny, I know you in your talk already, you probably shared a lot of it and I've heard some of it, but I know based upon what you've said that your memoir explores and talks a lot about, the trauma, uh, the grief that you went through, as a result of the separation. So can you, just share, insights into how this separation affected your life and the lives of others you encountered, in your life's journey? As brief as you can, because there's so much we want to talk about in your story. It's such an interesting
I think
story.
the feeling of being untethered and unknown uh,
Mm-hmm.
leaves such a huge anxiety in someone. You feel so much like a otherness, randomness. It's just such an unsettling feeling. And I always had that with me, and I didn't understand why because it wasn't talked about as I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And I developed really severe panic disorder. I mean, I never did LSD, but I mean, my panic attacks were like being on drugs. I mean, shooting stars and sparks and sort of this feeling of dissolving and I mean, just horrible. And every time I experienced one, I thought I was dying or going crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And they plagued me for most of my life, well into my late 20s when I finally found some help for them. But it was this it was this inability to kind of process these feelings I was having and this just emptiness and nothingness and aloneness. And it was so profound. It also stopped me, not only the panic attacks, but just that feeling I clung to anything familiar. so I wasn't a brave young woman. I didn't do, take on
Hmm.
challenges, things that others might have. And I was very dependent on my adoptive family. And I played the role of the perfect adoptee because God forbid that I was given away again, even
Hmm.
though never seemed like a possibility in my adoptive family, but it's just this thing you just bring with you
I
to
see.
the
I hear
situation.
you. Okay.
And so that trauma, I mean, that was trauma. And depression, suffered from depression and these panic attacks that really limited my life and my development for decades. And until I got help, I mean, I saw a therapist. I had some medication for the severity of the panic attacks, and actually have spent most of my life in and out of therapy, which has been so profoundly helpful to process all of these things and understand them with the guidance of people who know more about child development and things that I wasn't trained in.
Mm.
Um, and I think that talking about it, I know that as I talk about it, or as people have read the advanced copies of my book, other adoptees have been so grateful for putting the language to it. And one of the things I really wanted to do in my book was I wanted to explore and express the feelings of being adopted, those lost, alone,
Hmm.
terrified feelings, because that's what it's hard to communicate. I wasn't just telling my story. I didn't really want to write a memoir, but I wanted to really communicate what this feels like so that other adoptees could feel affirmed in their experience, and people who didn't know anything about adoption and now are asked to, maybe vote on, should we open the birth records in our state, or should we, how should we think about donor conceived individual rights? They could go, oh, but I've read this thing and I now know what those individuals feel like. It's not just about the parents involved, but it's a lifelong trauma for the individual, the adoptee involved, and we need to think about their rights. So
Oh, it's very, very interesting. You know, I'm just sitting here thinking about your story, how you must have been feeling, and you talk about, you know, lots of stuff in your profile, and I can hear you. So I have not read the book, but I'm hoping that listeners of this podcast would get it, and I'm perhaps going to get it myself because it says so much. I feel it in your talk. Um, so tell us a little bit about how it has kind of shaped your own experience because you're now obviously way adult past, but you lived through this. And this de- detachment and longing, you know, that you experience as an adoptee. How did it shape your own experience? Talk a little bit about that, if you will.
sure. Well, I think when it made me a more introspective person, it made me a reflective and thoughtful person. I read a lot since I was sort of a loner and alone. I found great solace in the natural world, and so I think it made me. I am a writer and an artist, and so I think it brought
Hmm.
out my creativity. Um, and I think it made me really value connection and loyalty. And
Okay.
I, boy, in family or in friends, it's so important to me, and understanding, being sensitive to others' needs. Well, which is a good and bad thing. I'm very sensitive to other people's needs because growing up, I wanted to be perfect and not rejected. So it
Hmm.
didn't come from necessarily a good place, um, but being loyal to my friends and family, and keeping connections and building connections has been very significant
Okay.
result of my experience.
Mm. Wow. Very, very interesting. I said to you, I think in our talk before we went on to recording this interview that I wanted to ask you about what you would say to someone who has gone through some similar experiences or may not even gone through nothing like you've gone through, but they have had their moments. They've gone through some depressed times in their lives, low in spirit, a lot of things that can happen that can kind of get us out of sorts. Based upon what you have gone through, is there anything that you would say to listeners of this podcast that would be encouraging, inspiring, and transforming to
Yeah,
them?
I think one thing is just trust yourself and trust your gut. If
Mm,
you don't feel right, if you don't understand why you're feeling the way you are in the world, something's happening. There is something off. And so, and then seek help. Find someone to listen. If you're young, start with your parents or a teacher, or if you belong to a church, seek help. But or an outside group that perhaps
mm,
you've read about that may support you. But it's that trust your gut. We know when something's not right in our lives. We know when we feel off. We're not, and don't ignore that, and see it as a strength. See
mm,
that not being weak, but saying, if I face this, if I go there and face this and get, maybe I need help to do so, but when I face this, I will be a stronger person. I have a stronger me and have a more successful life going forward. But it's that trusting yourself and believing yourself, especially for young people, with all the flaws you may think you have, and the chaos you may feel inside of you. Um, there's all good stuff in there. It's just,
mm.
you just gotta listen to it and then sort it out. And that's how you build a strong you.
Okay. Well, listen, I hope you're taking this to heart because this is some very good advice. Um, Janet is giving us a lot to think about and a lot for you to take in. So please just uh, work with it because I think it will be helpful to you. Don't go nowhere, listeners. Please stay with us for just a few more minutes as we ask Janet a few more questions and discuss a little bit more about her journey. But first of all, I want to ask Janet, could you tell listeners of this podcast uh, where they can get your book uh, and anything else like a website or that they can get more information on you if they're interested?
Sure. My book is Abandoned at Birth: Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me. And it is available for pre order. It was published May 7th, but pre order on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org, and BAM. And I do have a website, abandonedatbirthbook.com, or an Instagram at Janet Sherlund Official.
Okay. So, listeners, that's Abandoned at Birth. And the author is Janet Sherlund. So please check her out. Check her out. You will be really, I think, amazed when you read her journey. It's compelling. Janet, let me ask you a couple of more questions as it relates to your book and your life journey. Now, your search began with a false narrative that you kind of talk about, and that was provided by the adoption agency. So, how did these false details impact your journey, and what advice would you give to others, navigating similar situations?
Well, I didn't have much information because laws prevented it.
Okay.
But at one point I had written to them and said, what non-identifying information can you give me? And they gave me a very Hollywood Hallmark version so there was false information about maybe where my parents had lived or what they were doing as occupations. And so if I had tried to search based on that information, it would have taken me down the wrong path.
Okay.
And actually, I didn't find out the real information until after Search and Reunion that was successful many decades later. And so I'd say independence in your, I would say never believe anything that an agency tells you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, that I would say use as many independent sources as you can, because and always think about the motivation behind information you're being given.
Hmm.
That there could be other interests than your own involved.
I'm certain you mentioned it, but I've got to ask because I know listeners of this podcast want to know. Did you ever contact or find your biological parents?
I did. I ultimately met both my biological father. First, my father. My mother refused to meet me. And luckily, the agency had the name of my biological father, which hadn't been required back in the 50s. So that was unusual.
Hmm.
Um, and I had both the best and worst reunion stories. I had, one that was just wonderful and transformative, and one that to this day hurts. So,
Okay.
um,
So I assume just what you just said, the one that was very transformative was with your father.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
I mean, he just was like, he knew nothing about me. He
Hmm.
was 75 years old watching Jeopardy one night when he got the phone call that he had a daughter who'd like to meet him.
Oh
And
wow.
he was
This
pretty
is
surprised.
this is
Uh,
exciting.
yeah.
Very,
And
very
when he
exciting.
once he verified that the agency was legit, he took the second phone call and he said, of course, if she has my blood, she's my daughter. Of course, I want to meet her. So that was
Oh
a wonderful.
wow. Wow. Exciting. Exciting. How old were you when you first made this contact?
I think I was about 56 years old. 56.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I was
What
very lucky he was still with us. And
oh, what an exciting journey. What an exciting journey. I know your book, Abandon That Faith, uh, as listening to you and reading a little bit of your profile, obviously aims to start conversation about rights, you know, laws, grief, belonging, and identity. So, how do you envision these conversations contributing to a broader societal understanding and change? Because everybody got their own thoughts and opinions about, you know, adoption and other social matters that we deal with in society.
I think I'd hope that for everyone, not just adoptees, but everyone who reads my book will have a better understanding of what happens to the individual at the center of adoption, and also think more deeply about their own sense of identity and belonging, and what that means in life, and maybe appreciate what they do have, or and also when they go to the voting booth, and are asked to make decisions about the laws that affect other people like adoptees or donor conceived individuals, that they have a better understanding of how that affects those people, and you know in whatever way they vote, that at least they're bringing to it a deeper understanding of someone else's journey.
Wow. Wow. Well, what an exciting uh, story you're sharing with listeners of this podcast today. I'm moved, I'll be honest with you. I often look for guests who I know can share stories that can encourage, inspire and transform. And certainly your story has been that. And I'm grateful that you chose to give this podcast the opportunity to have you on as a guest. And in what ways do you hope your memoir will resonate with readers who may have some similar experiences?
I think by writing the feelings. I think by really people who have read the book said, I really felt it. I really felt it, and I think that's the thing we all share, right? Is
Hmm.
feelings,
Hmm.
and we all experience these. We all question identity. We all feel loss and grief and separation and the joy of reunion. And I think, by really trying to capture those feelings, that people can just feel affirmed or inspired to allow their own, to let themselves feel their own feelings and heal themselves. And because it is possible, sometimes I love the expression, the only way out is through. And I think you have to face your fears and feel them and work through them.
Thank you so much, Janet. You've been an awesome guest today, and I do appreciate your story. And I'm certain listeners will enjoy hearing what you had to say.
Well,
And
thank you very
again,
much.
thank you. And there you have it, Janet Sherlund, who I say shares an awesome story of the quest to find a biological mother. What an awesome story. And until next time, peace and blessings be with each of you.